I should have turned back the moment I caught that smell. You know the one I mean if you've ever done this kind of thing. That metallic tang that hits the back of your throat and makes your eyes water. It's always the first sign that you've found something interesting. I was exploring the old railway cutting that runs behind the industrial estate on the south side of town. Nothing special about it, just your typical abandoned Victorian-era tunnel that the council forgot existed. Perfect for an afternoon's exploration while the weather was decent. The tunnel itself was unremarkable. Brick archway, maybe 50 meters long, with the usual collection of beer cans and cigarette butts that teenage vandals leave behind. I was about halfway through when my torch beam caught something odd in the wall. There was a door. Not particularly unusual on its own, maintenance access, probably. But this one was different. Heavy wooden construction, looked far older than the tunnel itself. The wood was so dark it was nearly black, and there were iron reinforcements across it in a pattern I didn't recognize. More importantly, it was slightly ajar. The metallic smell was strongest here, mixed with something else. Something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in water. My torch wasn't working properly, the beam kept flickering, but I could see stone steps leading downward behind the door. I should mention that I'd done my research on this tunnel beforehand. Council records, historical surveys, the works. There was nothing about any connecting passages or basement access. According to every official document, this tunnel was a simple straight-through cutting with no additional structures. But there I was, looking at stone steps that definitely predated the tunnel by decades, maybe centuries. The smart thing would have been to go back, get proper equipment, maybe bring someone else. Instead, I pushed the door open wider and stepped through. The steps were carved directly into bedrock, worn smooth by centuries of use. They spiraled downward in a tight curve, and the walls were lined with niches, the kind you might find in ancient catacombs. My torch beam was getting weaker, but I could make out what looked like metal nameplates on some of the niches. That's when the smell got worse. Not just metallic now. There was decay there, old and settled, like something that had been rotting for so long it had become part of the stone itself. I had to breathe through my mouth, but that just made it worse because then I could taste it. At the bottom of the steps, maybe 20 feet down, was another door. This one was steel, institutional looking, with a small window set at eye level. The glass was thick and yellowed with age. I pressed my face to the window and immediately wished I hadn't. It was a morgue. No question about it. Stainless steel tables arranged in neat rows, though the steel had long since lost its shine and was now mottled with rust and stains I didn't want to think about. There were gurneys pushed against the walls, some still occupied by shapes under what had once been white sheets. The sheets had turned brown with age. But here's the thing that really got to me, this morgue was huge. Far bigger than the space should have allowed for. I could see it stretching back into darkness, row after row of tables and equipment, like it went on for hundreds of meters. The door wasn't locked. I know. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to get back up those steps and out of that tunnel as fast as possible. But you have to understand, I'd never found anything this significant before. This wasn't just an extra room or a slightly longer corridor. This was an entire facility that couldn't possibly exist. The morgue was exactly what you'd expect from a place that had been abandoned for decades. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. Some of the fluorescent lights overhead were still flickering intermittently, casting strange shadows that moved when there should have been nothing moving. The smell was overwhelming now. Not just decay, there was antiseptic mixed in there too, that sharp hospital smell that never quite goes away no matter how long a place has been empty. It was like walking into a time capsule of death. I tried to move quietly between the tables, but every step echoed despite the dust that should have muffled sound. Some of the gurneys still had their occupants, wrapped in those yellowed sheets. I didn't look too closely, but I could see the general shapes. Human shapes that had been there so long they'd practically mummified. At the far end of the morgue, I found a set of double doors marked, "Authorized personnel only." They opened onto a stairwell, concrete steps, metal railings, the kind of utilitarian construction you'd find in any hospital. I climbed. The first landing opened onto a corridor that stretched in both directions, lined with doors. Most were marked with room numbers, some with departmental signs, radiology, pathology, psychiatric evaluation. The walls were that institutional green color that was popular in hospitals decades ago, though the paint was peeling and stained with water damage. What struck me immediately was how wrong the proportions felt. The corridor was too wide, the ceiling too high. It felt more like a cathedral than a hospital hallway. And it was completely silent except for my footsteps and the distant hum of electricity that suggested some power was still running somewhere in the building. I tried several doors, but they were all locked. The few windows I could find were tiny, barely large enough to put your fist through, and so filthy that I couldn't make out anything through them. I scraped away some of the grime with my sleeve and peered out. What I saw didn't make sense. Through the window, I could see what looked like rolling hills covered in some kind of vegetation I didn't recognize. The sky had a strange yellowish tinge to it, and there was no sun visible despite the fact that it had been broad daylight when I entered the tunnel. More disturbing still, the landscape stretched to the horizon without a single familiar landmark. No roads, no buildings, no power lines. Nothing that suggested human habitation. I was supposed to be maybe 20 feet underground in an area I knew well. There should have been the industrial estate visible, or at least the edge of town. Instead, I was looking out at what appeared to be an alien world. I moved faster through the corridors after that, looking for an exit. Any exit. But every door I tried was either locked or led to another corridor, another wing of this impossible hospital. I climbed more stairs and found more floors, wards with rows of empty beds, operating theaters with equipment that looked decades out of date, offices with paperwork still scattered on the desks as if everyone had just stepped out for lunch and never come back. The smell was different up here. Less decay, more of that metallic tang, mixed with something medicinal that made my sinuses burn. And there was something else, a sound I couldn't quite identify. It was very faint, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Almost like breathing, but too slow and too deep to be human. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. The sound was getting louder as I moved through the corridors, and I started to make out other noises mixed in with the breathing. Heavy footsteps, but irregular, not the steady pace of someone walking, but the shuffling, stumbling gait of something that wasn't quite sure how to use its legs. And every so often, a snuffling sound like something with a very large nose trying to pick up a scent. My scent. I started moving faster, but the layout of the hospital made no sense. Corridors that should have led to exits instead curved back on themselves. Stairwells that should have gone down instead seemed to spiral upward indefinitely. It was like the building was actively trying to keep me inside. The breathing was getting closer. I found myself in what looked like a children's ward, small beds with faded cartoon characters painted on the headboards, toy boxes still full of rotting stuffed animals. The windows here were the same tiny apertures, but when I looked out, the landscape had changed. Instead of rolling hills, I could see what looked like an ocean, but the water was black and perfectly still. Behind me, something heavy crashed into a door. I ran. The corridors blurred together as I sprinted through them, taking turns at random, just trying to get away from the sound of whatever was hunting me through the hospital. It was getting closer. I could hear it knocking over equipment, slamming into walls, making sounds that were almost like speech but not quite. Like someone trying to form words with a mouth that wasn't designed for human language. I finally found the stairwell I'd come up and took the steps 3 at a time, nearly falling in my haste to get back to the morgue. Behind me, I could hear my pursuer crashing down the stairs, but it seemed to be having trouble navigating them. Whatever it was big and clumsy and very, very angry. The morgue felt like a sanctuary by comparison, even with its rows of decades-old corpses. I weaved between the tables, heading for the steel door that led back to the stone steps. My torch was barely working now, just giving off occasional weak flickers, but I could see the doorway ahead. Something roared behind me. Not a human sound, not even close. It was like a bull crossed with a foghorn, full of rage and hunger. I didn't look back. I hit the stone steps running and didn't slow down until I burst through the wooden door and back into the tunnel. The afternoon sunlight streaming in from both ends had never looked so beautiful. I ran the entire length of the tunnel and didn't stop until I was back on the street, gasping and shaking. That night, I did what I always do after finding somewhere interesting. I researched hospital records for the area going back 2 centuries, planning permissions for any major construction, historical surveys, archaeological reports, geological studies of the bedrock. I checked everything I could think of. There has never been a hospital anywhere near that tunnel. In fact, there's never been any major building within a half-mile radius. The land has been undeveloped since records began, and the geological surveys confirm that the bedrock in that area is solid limestone with no natural or artificial cavities. According to every official record that exists, what I found down there is impossible. I went back the next day, of course. Had to. Brought a better torch, a camera, even a measuring tape to document the dimensions properly. The door was gone. Not locked, not sealed, gone. There was just blank brick wall where it had been, as if it had never existed at all. I spent 2 hours examining every inch of the tunnel wall, looking for any sign that there had ever been an opening there. Nothing. But I can still smell it sometimes, that metallic tang mixed with antiseptic and decay. It lingers in my clothes, in my hair, like the place is trying to remind me that it's still there, just waiting. I haven't done any urban exploration since then. Can't bring myself to. Because now I know that some of these impossible places don't just bend the rules of architecture and physics. Some of them have things living inside them. Things that are very, very hungry.
If you love horror stories, like and subscribe. I post new stories at least twice a week.